In this unit, we're going to look at the War of the Union, 1861 to 1865. The focus questions that we're going to be looking at are the following. What were the respective advantages of the North and South as the Civil War began, and how did those advantages affect the military strategies of the Union and the Confederacy? Second, why did Abraham Lincoln decide to issue the Emancipation Proclamation? How did it impact the war? Third, in what ways did the war affect social and economic life in the North and South? Fourth, what were the military turning points in 1863 and 1864 that ultimately led to the Confederates' defeat? And five, how did the Civil War change the nation? The Civil War can become confusing for a student studying it for the first time. For the two sides, what I've done to help you through this is, first of all, North, Union, and Federals. They're all the same. The leaders, generals, and battles won by the North will be indicated in the color blue, Union being blue. For the South, rebels, and Confederates, they all mean the same thing, and their leaders, generals, and the battles won by the South will be indicated in red.
Choosing sides. The war begins, 1861.
The causes of the war. The reasons given for the South seceding are as varied as the soldiers who fought in the conflict. Many in the South viewed it as a reaction necessary to protect their states' rights as guaranteed under the Constitution. Others argued it was due to the tariffs that fell disproportionately on the South. The South was indeed paying 80% of all the federal taxes. Actions by the leaders of the Confederacy often spoke to the heart of the matter. That was truly the issue of secession was the South's desire to retain slaves and to take them into new territories. They were losing their political power in Washington and believed it was just only a matter of time before slavery would be abolished. War fever. Although Lincoln never requested a declaration of war from Congress after the fall of Fort Sumter, doing so would actually recognize the South as being a legitimate government and country. Lincoln did declare the attack as an insurrection, and issued a call for 75,000 volunteers for 90 days to defend the Union, to begin on the 15th of April. He called for a special session of Congress on July 4th, 1861. On April 19th, he ordered the blockading of southern ports. He also authorized the spending for the war without congressional approval, seized northern telegraph offices who spoke out against Lincoln, and once Lincoln issued the order, 4 more states seceded from the Union in the order of Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Arkansas. The Supreme Court later ruled that this had the same effect as a declaration of war. The border states like Delaware, although a slave state, remained in the Union, and Maryland, also a slave state, was forced by federal troops to remain in the Union as well. Lincoln suspended the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus. The mayor of Baltimore and newspaper editors were thrown into jail for the duration of the war without charge. The western portion of Virginia seceded from the state and was admitted into the Union as West Virginia in 1863. Missouri and Kentucky also remained. In Kentucky and Missouri, choosing sides was especially complicated. Pro-Confederate militia clashed with pro-Union forces, many of whom were European immigrants, German Americans especially. Robert E. Lee of Virginia was asked to lead the Federal Army against the forces of the Confederacy, but he refused, stating that his state became before the Union. As said by Lee, I dare not draw my sword against my country. Although the majority of Southerners fought for the Confederacy, over 100,000 soldiers who fought for the Union were Southern by birth. Both sides believed that it would be a short war before the first battle, thinking that one battle would solve the war in itself. Both Northerners and Southerners strongly supported their government's war fever, led many to volunteer for military service. The initial enthusiasm for serving faded, leading to drafts, first by the Confederacy and later by the Union. Regional advantages. First, looking at the Northern. The North had a huge advantage in industry and development of industry, and its foundries turned out most of the firearms used by the Union forces. The North easily outnumbered the South when it came to manufacturing. The South was still overwhelmingly agrarian, and the South only had one factory, the Trafalgar Iron Works in Richmond. Population. The North also outnumbered the South in total population by almost 5 to 1. The border states, Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware, remained in the Union. This left 23 states in the Union with a population of about 22 million, including 400,000 slaves. The Confederacy, on the other hand, consisted of 11 states with a population of 9 million, including about 3.5 million slaves. Transportation. 70% of the railroads were in the North, and Lincoln made a crucial decision early on to make the gauge, the width of the track, of the railroads the same. This way, goods could be transported across the Union without trains stopping and unloading and loading on a different railroad line. The Union had a navy, the Confederacy did not. For the Union, the war was seen to restore the Union, not to free slaves. The firing on Sumter was seen as an act of treason. For Southerners, what they developed was looking at their geography. The Southern landscape played a significant strategic role in the Civil War, and its idiosyncrasies led to several tragic errors of judgment involving the realities of the Southern natural environment. The South's defense, forest, uneven terrain, heat, and humidity hampered traditional battle tactics and exhausted the troops. The South decided to fight a defensive war. At the beginning of the war, the Confederacy would fight a defensive war, and this required few supplies and soldiers, which benefited the cause greatly. However, eventually the Union's technology superiority would enable it to transcend environmental barriers. The First Battle of Bull Run, Manassas, July 21st, 1861. The North and South had different names for many of the same battles. The North usually named them after geographical features, while the South named them after a nearby town. Brigadier General Irwin McDowell outlined a plan for attacking the Confederates in Virginia, but he did not want to fight. "This is not an army," he warned the President. "It is true that you are green. They are green also. We are all green alike," said Lincoln. On July 16th, the volunteer army of 37,000 men marched into Virginia. Their aim? To cut off the railroad at Manassas, then move on at last to Richmond. General P.G.T. Beauregard. By July 30th, the Confederate Army was 35,000. Beauregard made his headquarters in Wilmer McLean's farmhouse. The Confederates formed an 8-mile meandering line along the side of Bull Run Creek, less than 25 miles from Washington. Hundreds of Washingtonians rode out in hoping to see a real battle. Field glasses, picnic baskets, and bottles of champagne. And on the morning of the 21st, McDowell sent his men across Bull Run. They smashed into the left side of the Confederate line. An onlooker said the advancing army looked like a bristling monster, lifting itself in a slow, wavering motion up the laborious ascent. Union victory seemed all but assured. Holding a hill in the center of the Southern line was the Virginia Brigade under the command of Brigadier General Thomas J. Jackson. While other commands wavered, Jackson's held firm. Brigadier General Bernard E. Bee of South Carolina said, "Look, there's Jackson with the Virginians standing like a stone wall. Rally around the Virginians." The name Stonewall would stick. At 4 p.m., as the Union attack had faltered and Beauregard had received late Confederate reinforcements arriving by horseback and train from the valley, he ordered a counterattack. Jackson ordered his men to yell like furies. The rebel yell, first heard that day, would echo on 1,000 battlefields. The Union Army broke and retreated back to Washington, getting entangled in the carriages heading back as well. A regular Army Reserve unit of 2,000 is all that stood in the way between the Confederate Army and Washington, D.C. When Jefferson Davis arrived, he urged his generals forward. Jackson said if he had 10,000 fresh troops, he would take Washington, but there were none. Lessons learned from Bull Run. Casualties. For the Union, there was 2,708 casualties. Of those 2,708, 481 were dead, 1,011 wounded, 1,216 missing, most of them captured. Confederate casualties consisted of 1,982, 387 dead, 1,582 wounded, and only 13 missing. At the Battle of Bull Run, the Federal forces were defeated, but the exhausted Confederates did not give chase. This battle gave the lie to the conventional wisdom that the time that the war would be over, one decisive victory for either side, and it would just only be a 90-day war. Union strategy before Bull Run. Secretary of State Seward suggested the war should be over in 90 days, but Scott warned that it would take at least 300,000 men, one good general, and up to 3 years to conquer the South. Scott's plan, that was dubbed the Anaconda Plan by the press, called for a three-pronged attack that was designed to steadily squeeze the life out of the South. First, blockade the southern ports along its 3,550-mile line of coastline while organizing a Union invasion. About 800 vessels managed to evade the blockade in the first year. 6,000 ships had entered and cleared southern ports in 1860. The chances of capture were 1 in 10 in 1861. This would be reduced to 1 to 3 in 1864. Second, protect the United States capital, Washington, D.C., while Union forces advanced on all fronts. Third, slowly divide the South into parts, sending troops down the Mississippi to divide the Western Confederacy from the East. Lincoln rejected the plan since enlistment was only for 90 days. What he hoped for is that the war would be over before Congress was back in session and then he could reconstruct the states. After the Bull Run, he will end up adopting the plan. Southern strategy. The South hoped to win enough defensive battles to secure recognition from a foreign government and to convince enough Northerners that the war was not worth fighting. This, the Southern strategists reasoned, would then make it more likely for the United States to grant the Confederacy independence. Foreign recognition was vital to Confederate interest if the Confederates hoped to survive. Much like the rebellious colonies had courted France a century before, the rebels hoped to secure French recognition. Interesting to note is that the French agreed, but only as long as Great Britain would follow suit. But under pressure from the United States, Great Britain was split into two camps. There was pro-Union, led by Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, Lord John Russell, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Lord Richard Lyons, the Minister to the United States. On the pro-Confederate side was Henry Palmerston, the Prime Minister, and William Gladstone, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. The English dependence myth of King Cotton, and Southerners thought cotton was the world staple. Cut off cotton, the world will collapse. This belief leads to diplomacy of coercion instead of persuasion. And in 1861, the Confederacy orders an embargo on cotton shipments to Great Britain and even orders the bales to be burned. Britain already had a large surplus of cotton, unbeknownst to the Southerners from previous years. Southern emissaries would then be unofficially sent, not to spark the wrath of the U.S. Secretary of State. These new emissaries, James Mason to England and John Slidell to France, boarded the British mail packet, the HMS Trent, from Havana on November 6, 1861. The Trent is going to be stopped by the USS San Jacinto, commanded by Captain Charles Wilkes, who arrested Mason and Slidell and took them back to Boston and put them behind bars for trial. Prime Minister Palmerston was outraged and ordered 6,000 British regulars to Canada. one war at a time, Lincoln said to Seward and ordered the release of the Confederates. Mason and Slidell arrived in January of 1862 and were cordially received in Europe. Forming the armies. Whole Union towns signed up. Prominent citizens would form regiments. Men elected their junior officers, who would in turn elect senior officers. The president, of course, appointed officers to the rank of general. For example, the 10th Michigan was made up of Flint boys. The regimental commander was the town's mayor. The regimental surgeon was the town's doctor. William Tecumseh Sherman had resigned as superintendent of Louisiana Military Academy and said to his brother, "You politicians have got us into a hell of a fix, and you can get us out the best you can. I'll have no more to do with it." But after the firing on Fort Sumter, Sherman put on his uniform. He was prophetic when he claimed, "You might as well put out a burning house with a squirt gun. I think this is going to be a long war, very long, much longer than any politician thinks." Lincoln on the 4th of July requested an additional 400,000 men for the war. When it became increasingly apparent that the war would take much longer, but in special session, Congress authorized the raising of 500,000 for the duration. In the Confederates, they would raise an army of 60,000 men. And Nathan Bedford Forrest would make himself a millionaire selling cotton slaves, put up posters to form a regiment of cavalry. The Clinch Rifles started out in Augusta, Georgia in 1861. Only the drummer boy would survive the war. The Confederate Congress at first had 1 year enlistments for 100,000, then authorized an army of 400,000. After 1862, enlistments were for 3 years or the duration of the war. The total enlistments were 1,556,678 Union to 1,082,119 Confederate. But because of the offensive nature, invasion, and need for long lines of communication, the North's numerical strength was not the asset as the figures might suggest. The Federal Congress at first relied on recruits to field the armies. The Confederacy also initially relied on recruits, but by 1862 it had started an involuntary draft. In 1863, the Union would follow suit. Why they fought. Women in the Army. Some women secretly joined the Union and Confederate armies disguised as men. There were no physical exams in the recruiting stations. True identities were discovered in hospitals. Some fought through the entire war and survived. For some, like their male counterparts, their motivation was purely patriotic. Others did it for love, taking to the battlefields in order to remain close to their husband, lover, fiance, father, or brother. But for many, the reason was economic. An Army private made $13 a month. That was double what a seamstress, laundress, or maid could make. Sarah Rosetta Wakerman, for example, enlisted in the Union Army as Lyons Wakeman and managed to fight as a private until she died of dysentery and was buried in a New Orleans cemetery, far from her New York farm home. Janine Rogers, also known as Albert Cashier, fought for the Union Army. Sarah Emma Edmonds, known as Frank Thompson, enlisted in the 2nd Michigan Militia and served for 2 years. 25 years later, she would receive her military pension. What was at stake? Well, for Confederates, many believed that they had been pushed into the war by an increasingly powerful northern United States, whose economic power and population overshadowed the southern needs. Union victory in the war, under this reasoning, would essentially lead to a form of economic political enslavement of white Southerners. Even most Southern whites who did not own slaves feared that the end of race-based slavery in the Southern states, due to the economic devastation and social upheaval it had the potential to bring. For the Union, most Union soldiers agreed that the primary goal was to save the Union and keep the United States together as one nation. Many Union soldiers, in fact, opposed the ending of slavery. As the war dragged on, soldiers on both sides really fought for each other. They were brothers in arms. If they were wounded, They tried to escape the field hospitals to rejoin their units. Their biggest fear was not dying in battle, but to be branded a coward. Since the regiments were formed from towns, everyone knew one another. Even the last months of the war, the Confederate soldiers who stayed on, despite pleas from their mothers, sisters, wives, and lovers to come home, they could not bear to leave their comrades in arms. Families, especially those in the border states, were often divided by their loyalties, and the war truly was a civil war, and that it divided not only the nation and states, but also communities and families. Life of a soldier. Most of the people who fought in this war did not have prior military training. Most of the soldiers, about half of those in the Union and two-thirds in the Confederates, came from farming backgrounds. About one-third of the Confederate soldiers were illiterate. Camp life was often monotonous. Conditions were primitive, unsanitary, facilities inadequate, rations coarse and poorly cooked, and diet lacking nutrition. Union Army regulations were also lacking. Junior officers elected and not trained one-fourth of the camps were filthy, open latrines, and garbage. Diet was consisted of hardtack, which was 3 cups of flour, 1 cup of water, and two teaspoons of salt, salt pork, and coffee. The lack of fresh vegetables and fruit often led to outbreaks of scurvy. Because army camps were tight-knit grounds, contagious diseases such as measles or chickenpox, whooping cough, and measles that could decimate a camp within days. Indeed, most soldiers had more to fear from illness than enemy bullets. 17,000 Confederate soldiers died of typhoid in 18 months. Boredom was a chronic problem in most Army camps. Drilling helped make up some of the day. Soldiers wrote long letters home or read books, magazines, and newspapers when they could get them. They played cards or engaged in various sports, such as baseball, boxing, and cockfighting. Some camps, desperate for activity, even staged cockroach and lice races. Drinking and gambling were discouraged by military officials, but both activities were nearly impossible to control, especially after payday. Prayer meetings were plentiful. The weapons were rifled muskets, 577 caliber Enfield or 58 caliber Springfield. Being rifled, the accuracy increased over smoothbore muskets. Both fired the meanie ball. An expert could hit a target at 400 yards. Properly trained, an infantryman could fire 3 shots in 1 minute. For artillery, the weapons were 12-pound howitzers. The balls exploded, sending shrapnel. The crew consisted of a sergeant and an 8-man crew. They were very well trained and they could fire 2 rounds in a minute. For drilling, the first thing in the morning is drill, then drill, then drill again, then drill a little bit more, then drill, then lastly, drill. Between drills, we drill and stop for something to eat and have a roll call, said one Union soldier. The new recruits were generally opposed to regimentation. Those who violated orders could be bucked and gagged and whipped. Cowardice, desertion, theft, sleeping on guard duty, treating with the enemy, spying, murder, and bounty jumping brought the hardest punishments: execution by firing squad or hanging. Blacks in the South from the beginning, many enslaved black men and women believed that the war was about freeing them from slavery. As a result, many plantation owners found their slaves listless, hard to drive, and doing very little after they had been motivated by the war. Some volunteered to help their masters while at war for the Confederacy, while others served for spies for the Union. Robert Smalls. In one dramatic case, an enslaved harbor pilot named Robert Smalls stole the CSS Planter in Charleston Harbor and headed out to sea to try to attain freedom. Smalls served as a Union naval ship pilot during the war and later became a South Carolina legislator and U.S. congressman. Fighting in the West, 1861 and 1862. War in the West. While the North and South warred, the West was being rapidly populated. During the war, Idaho, Nevada, Arizona, and Montana would be added to the Union. These new areas required federal troops for protection and drew men and supplies from the war effort back east. In addition, loyalties in the West were complicated. Some Native American nations or individuals sided with the Confederacy, whereas others remained loyal to the Union. The theaters of the Civil War are divided into two categories: the area east of the Appalachian Mountains and the area west of that range. Kentucky and Tennessee. General Albert Sidney Johnson's 72,000 men, one-fourth west of the Mississippi, and the Confederates were deployed in a cordon, or line defense, subject to attack, most vulnerable where the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers would meet. General Ulysses S. Grant would employ the wise strategy of combined land and sea attacks. At Fort Henry in February 1862, Henry was a Confederate earthen fort on the Tennessee River with outdated guns and was partially inundated by the rivers threatening to flood the rest. Brigadier General Grant was given the go-ahead by General Halleck, and on February 4th through the 5th, Grant would land his division in two different locations, one on the east bank of the Tennessee River to prevent the garrison's escape, and the other to occupy the high ground of the Kentucky side, which ensured the fort's fall. Flag Officer Andrew H. Foote's 7 gunboats began bombarding the fort. General Brigadier Lloyd Tigman, the Confederate commander of the fort's garrison, realized that it was only a matter of time before Fort Henry would fall. While leaving artillery in the fort to hold off the Union fleet, he escorted the rest of his forces of 2,500 out of the area and sent them safely off on a route to Fort Donelson, 10 miles away. Tigman then returned to the fort and soon afterward surrendered to the fleet, which had engaged the fort and closed within 400 yards. Fort Henry's fall opened the Tennessee River to Union gunboats and shipping as far as Muscle Shoals, Alabama. Fort Donelson. General Johnston then ordered an additional 12,000 men to the fort, and on February 14th, Foote attacked the fort at point-blank range, but then withdrew. The next day, on February 15th, Grant would land with 27,000 and encircle the fort. On the 16th of February, the Confederates attempted a breakout, but it would fail, and Brigadier General Simon Bolivar Buckner surrenders unconditionally to Grant. Not taken was a regiment under General Nathan Bedford Forrest, who had escaped through the icy backwaters. That was the only terms Grant would give, and from then on, some people would say that his initials U.S. and U.S. Grant meant unconditional surrender Grant. So now the two major transportation routes in the Confederate West, bounded by the Appalachians and the Mississippi River, became Union highways for movement of troops and material. The Union victories in the West gave them key strategic control of the Mississippi River. The Battle of Shiloh, April 6, 1862. Early in April 1862, Grant's 42,000 were encamped near Pittsburgh's Landing. Grant was waiting for General Buell to arrive on the Tennessee River. Buell was late. Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnson, commander of the Western Department of the Confederate Army, with his armies evenly matched, decided now was the time to attack. Tonight, we will water our horses in the Tennessee. On the morning of April 6, the Confederates quietly moved towards the Union lines. Grant wanted to get at the rebels at Corinth, believing that they had lost the ability to counterattack. There'll be no fighting at Pittsburgh Landing. We'll have to go to Corinth, where the rebels are fortifying. Confederate General Beauregard wanted to call it off, but was overruled by Johnson, who was following Clausewitz's dictum, friction of war. The battle would begin. Johnson's 40,000 slammed into Grant's 35,000. At the head of one of the Union's divisions was General William Tecumseh Sherman, who had shaken off the melancholy that had sent him home the previous year. His Ohioans were encamped at the little log cabin Methodist church called the Shiloh, when the 6th Mississippi attacked. The battle extended along a 3-mile front. The worst fighting was in the center, and according to Shelby Foote, the soldiers and generals did not know their job. None would retreat but stand and fight. The bloodiness of it astounded them. Also, it corrected a Southern misconception that one Southerner soldier could whip 10 Yankee hirelings. By late morning, most of the Union soldiers had retreated to the river. Grant's back was now to the Tennessee, and there was no sign of Buell and nowhere to go. General Johnston was mortally wounded and died that day. Beauregard would take command and assumed he could finish off Grant, whose back was to the Tennessee River. April 7th. Buell's army arrived at night unbeknownst to Beauregard, and at dawn 70,000 Union soldiers drove into Beauregard's 35,000. The Union held the field. Beauregard, sensing that his army was on the point of collapse, would withdraw. Grant did not press the attack, but Sherman did. Nathan Bedford Forrest covered the Confederate withdrawal. He found himself totally surrounded, but managed to escape. And while on a gallop, he swooped down and grabbed a Union private and flung him behind him on the horse. Union soldiers firing at Forrest ended up shooting their own man. And when Forrest got to the tree line, he dumped the body of the Union soldier. Casualties and Aftermath. 2,477 men were killed at Shiloh, 23,000 casualties overall. The Union lost 13,047 of 55,000 to the Confederate States' 10,694 of 42,000. More than those killed in action in America's war against Mexico and the War of 1812. Shelby Foote would claim the same number of casualties as Waterloo, and yet there's another 20 Waterloos to follow. Grant had believed that the South was already ready to give up before Shiloh. After Shiloh, he realized that it would take a war of conquest for the North to win. The aftermath of Shiloh proved a much-needed morale boost to the North's sagging emotions. Neither army had devised a way to take the wounded and the dead from the field. The victory preceded the legend of the South's invincibility, pierced it, I should say, but Grant was not allowed to pursue. Beauregard then seriously stung the South, having had his forces divided by the commander in the West, General Henry H. Halleck. And although inconclusive, a Union victory at the Battle of Shiloh at Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee, the South pulled back first, and it caused the South to pull most of its troops out of Tennessee as a result. Grant was blamed for the costliness of the Battle of Shiloh, with charges that he was an alcoholic and drunk during the battle. But Lincoln refused to relieve him because he was victorious. I can't spare this man. He fights. The Battle of New Orleans. Admiral David G. Farragut, with 17 Union warships, moved against Forts Jackson and Philip, 70 miles south of New Orleans. Farragut, on April 23rd to the 24th in 1862, and after a blazing gun battle, runs past the forts. The fleet reached New Orleans on the 25th, finding it defenseless. Most of the troops had left to go to Shiloh. Confederate Brigadier General Mansfield Lowell abandoned the city without a fight. Major General Benjamin Butler and his 15,000 took Forts Jackson and St. Philip on the 27th. And Butler would arrive in New Orleans on May 1st and orders martial law due to the mistreatment of his soldiers. The Battle of Perryville. One-third of Bragg's troops were at Perryville, Leonidas Polk and William J. Hardee's two corps. Facing 30,000 Federals, both sides were desperate to get access to fresh water. Their goal was to take Kentucky out of the Union. On October 8, 1862, Bragg's Army of the Mississippi attacked the Union left and at first succeeded, but then was repulsed. Don Carlos Buell, several miles away behind the action, was unaware that a major battle was taking place because of an unusual acoustic shadow. That is an area through which the sound waves fail to transmit due to the topographical obstruction, such as wind. Few sounds from the battle reached Buell's headquarters that was only 2 miles away. He did not alert effective control over the battle and committed no reserves until late in the day. The Union troops on the left flank were reinforced by 2 brigades, stabilized their lines, and the Confederate attack sputtered to a halt. Later, 3 Confederate regiments assaulted the Union division on the Springfield Pike, but were repulsed and they had to fall back into Perryville. Union troops pursued, and the skirmishing occurred in the streets until dark. Bragg would withdraw from Kentucky, and Union reinforcements were threatening the Confederate left flank, and Bragg, short of men and supplies, would have to withdraw during the night, even though now his army had converged together and could present a challenge to the Federals. After hearing the defeat in Mississippi, Bragg ordered the abandonment of Kentucky. The casualties were 3,700 for the Union and 3,000 for the Confederate. Bragg would go to Richmond to explain the campaign to Davis, and Davis was unaware of Bragg's corps commander's critique of Bragg and left him still in command. Perryville was viewed as a tactical victory for the South, but the campaign was a strategic victory for the Union, due because they failed to take Kentucky out of the Union. Fighting in the East. The war begins, 1861. On to Richmond. General George McClellan, Little Napoleon. After the debacle of Bull Run, Lincoln replaced commanding General Irwin McDowell with George McClellan. McClellan had proved an excellent organizer and strategist, but was horrible at implementation. McClellan would name the Army of the Potomac. Long training and discipline is what he focused on, and he advances slowly with his 121,000 men, 44 batteries of artillery, to move to Fortress Monroe. Lincoln was urging McClellan to strike a blow with his 100,000. Instead, he laid siege to Yorktown. Brigadier General John B. Magruder, a showy Virginian who loved amateur theatrics, kept a widely sporadic artillery barrage and paraded 1 battalion in and out of a clearing in an endless circle. That's all they did, is they just marched in circles. McClellan wired back, claimed that he had faced a superior army and called for reinforcements. General Joseph E. Johnston, a Confederate general, would say, "Nobody but McClellan would hesitate to attack." Magruder's 17,000 delayed his advance for a month. Johnston was able to amass his army between McClellan and Richmond. McClellan still claimed that he was outnumbered. The Monitor versus the Virginia. The CSS Virginia, former the Merrimac, was an ironclad which destroyed 2 Union warships at Hampton Roads, the USS Cumberland and the USS Minnesota. The USS Monitor would fight a 5-hour duel with the CSS Virginia. The Virginia would have to withdraw. At this point in time, all the world's navy was obsolete. This map shows the Peninsula Campaign. As we can see where McClellan started out in Washington and started coming down the Potomac. The Merrimac versus Virginia were a very important battle. After the Merrimac was able to drive off the Virginia, McClellan then could proceed over to Fort Moynes towards Yorktown. But as you can see, it's going to take him quite a while to try to get to the target, which is Richmond. The Shenandoah Campaign. With Robert E. Lee in control of the military operations, in order to keep McDowell's army in Fredericksburg from joining McClellan, Lee ordered Stonewall Jackson with 17,000 to give the Federals the impression that the Confederacy will cross the Potomac into Maryland. In this way, Lincoln will feel that the capital was threatened and not release McDowell's corps to McClellan. Jackson's campaign was brilliant. Jackson displayed an unforgivable demonstration of the leadership of intuition, audacity, and the will, using the employment of terrain, interior lines, mobility, surprise, and concentration of force against a divided enemy. Fighting a combined force 3 times his size, Major General Nathan Banks at the mouth of the valley, John C. Fremont in the Alleghanies west of the valley, and Brigadier General James Shields on the eastern side of the valley. Between May 8th and June 9th, Jackson used the Massanutten Mountains as a shield and struck out from the gaps. Jackson fought 5 battles, marched over 400 miles, and captured more Federals than he had in his entire army. Jackson's campaign tied down McDowell's troops of 60,000 from being sent to the 7 Days Campaign. Jefferson Davis would appoint Robert E. Lee as commander of the new Army of Northern Virginia. His appointment would deprive the Confederacy of a strategic guidance at the seat of government, a present-day United States Army Chief of Staff. His name is Audacity. He will take more chances and take them quicker than any other general in the country, north or south. Sam Watkins. I prefer Lee to Johnston. Lee is too cautious and weak under grave responsibility. Personally brave and energetic to a fault, he is yet wanting in moral firmness and when pressed by heavy responsibility. George McClellan. The 7 Days Campaign was a series of 6 major battles over the 7 days from June 25th, July 1st, 1863. On June 25, 1862, with a Union attack in the minor battle of Oak Grove, but McClellan quickly lost the initiative. On June 26 at Mechanicsville, Brigadier General Jeb Stuart, a dazzling cavalry ride 3 days and 100 miles around McClellan's army. His men burned Union camps, cut down telegraph poles, took prisoners and horses, and informed Lee of the Union's right. Brigadier General Fritz John Porter's Fifth Corps' flank was in the air. That means it's open for attack and not anchored. At the Battle of Mount Vernon Hill on July 1st, Lee would launch a futile frontal assault and suffer heavy casualties in the face of strong infantry and artillery defenses, believing that McClellan was in full retreat. The 7 days ended with McClellan's army in relative safety next to the James River, having suffered 16,000 casualties during the retreat. Lee's army, which had been on the offensive during the 7 days, lost over 20,000. As Lee became convinced McClellan would not resume his threat against Richmond, he moved north for the Northern Virginia Campaign and the American Campaign. Lincoln visited McClellan to find out what his next move would be. McClellan would write a blistering letter to the president, lecturing him that the Southern society, slavery, and economy should be left intact to save our poor country. On July 11th, General Halleck would replace McClellan as General-in-Chief and General Pope in command of the Army of the Potomac. The Second Battle of Manassas or Bull Run. General John Pope was placed in command of the Army of the Potomac. Lee's tactics at Second Bull Run campaign were unorthodox, but by dividing his forces he left both understrength and exposed. The disparity of numbers between the contending forces rendered the risk unavoidable. Lee took the risk of action to the certain loss of non-action. Jackson, following a wide-ranging flanking march 60 miles in 2 days. Jackson captured the Union supply depot at Manassas Junction. McClellan moved in to aid Pope, but almost too late, before communications between Pope and Lincoln were broken on 27 August 1862. Withdrawing a few miles to the northwest, Jackson took up the defensive positions on Stony Ridge. On August 28th, Jackson attacked an isolated Union column just east of Gainesville at Brawler's Farm, resulting in a stalemate. On that same day, the wing of Lee's army commanded Longstreet, the one you see pictured there, broke through the light Union resistance at the Battle of Thoroughfare Gap and approached the battlefield. General Pope, becoming convinced that he had been trapped, Jackson had concentrated the bulk of his army against him. On August 29th, Pope launched a series of assaults against Jackson's position along an unfinished railroad grade. The attacks were repulsed with heavy casualties on both sides. Pope ordered Porter to attack Jackson, his right flank, and General Andrew Porter refused because of his scouts had discovered that by noon Longstreet had arrived on the field from Thoroughfare Gap and took position on Jackson's right flank. On August 30th, Pope renewed his attack, seemingly unaware that Longstreet was on the field. When massed Confederate artillery devastated a Union assault by Porter's 5th Corps, Longstreet's wing of 25,000 men in 5 divisions countered attack in the largest simultaneous mass assault of the war. The Union left flank was crushed, and the army was driven back to Henry Hill. On September 1st, Lee was looking to destroy Pope and ordered Jackson in an arc to the north and east to cut off the retreating Federals. Only an effective rear guard action by Chantilly, Virginia, prevented the replay of the first Manassas disaster. The final battle of the skirmish cost the lives of Union generals Philip Kearny and J.J. Stevens and forced Pope to retreat again to Washington, D.C. The casualties for the Union were 16,000 killed in action, wounded, and missing. For Confederates, it was 1,300 killed in action, 9,000 wounded. McClellan blamed Pope. Pope blamed Porter, who was court-martialed for negligence and disobedience and dismissed. Lincoln, in despair, rode out to the soldiers' home. We might as well just stop fighting. Against the advice of some cabinet members, Lincoln would put McClellan in charge of the Army of the Potomac to defend the capital. If he can't fight himself, he excels in making others ready to fight, said Lincoln. Emancipation. Jesus. The Battle of Antietam. The South's victories in the early part of the war dampened the spirits of those in the North and the slaves in the South. As land in the South was captured by the Union, the Federal forces faced a new problem. What do you do with the newly liberated slaves? By 1862, Lincoln was openly talking with his cabinet about a permanent solution to the slave issue. McClellan being restored in command of the Army of the Potomac, and Lee invades Maryland in September of 1862 with the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee hopes that a victory will bring recognition for the Confederacy from Great Britain and possibly France. Lee's battle plan is going to be found wrapped around 6 cigars. 6 cigars. Now, McClellan finds that plan. Now, if you found that plan, you have the plan to beat Bobby Lee. How long would you wait to move out? McClellan would wait 16 hours before he broke camp and moved out to pursue Bobby Lee. The battle. Although Lee's number increased more than 40,000, McClellan still had a 2-to-1 advantage. Jackson's troops had marched all night with a portion of the troops to get to the left side of the line. Lee's back was to the Potomac River, and a strike here could end the war. An aide to Lee said there was a single item in our advantage, but it was an important one. McClellan had brought the superior forces to Sharpsburg, but he also brought himself. McClellan's plan called for a major effort of three corps: Brigadier General Joseph Hooker, Major General Edwin V. Sumner, and Brigadier General Joseph K. Mansfield against Lee's left flank and sever it from the river, while another corps under Burnside occupied the rest of the Confederate forces by attacking on the right flank at the Antietam Creek. The cornfield, after 2 hours and 2,500 casualties that went back where they were started. The cornfield was an area about 250 yards deep and 400 yards wide. It was the scene of indescribable destruction. It was estimated that the cornfield changed hands no fewer than 15 times in the course of the morning. The morning phase ended with the casualties on both sides of almost 1,300, including 2 Union Corps commanders. The Bloody Lane. The carnage from 9:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. on the sunken road gave it the name the Bloody Lane, leaving about 5,600 casualties, 3,000 for the Union, 2,600 for the Confederate, along the 800-yard road. And yet a great opportunity presented itself. If this broken sector of the Confederate line were exploited, Lee's army would have been divided in half and possibly defeated. There are ample forces available to do so, but Sumner, the senior corps commander, ordered him not to advance. The Burnside Bridge. Burnside made the fatal decision to cross the bridge even though the creek was only waist deep. After the third attempt, Burnside crossed the bridge, but the officers failed to transport ammunition across the bridge, which itself was becoming a bottleneck for soldiers, artillery, and wagons. This caused another 2-hour delay. Lee used this time to bolster his right flank. At a crucial moment, Confederate Major General A.P. Hill's division arrived from Harper's Ferry after a 17-mile march and launched a surprise counterattack, driving back Burnside and ending the battle. The aftermath. Antietam would be the single bloodiest day of the war. 3,600 Confederate troops, 2,700 were killed, 9,024 wounded, 2,000 missing, versus 87,000 Federal, in which 2,108 were killed, 9,549 were wounded, and 753 missing. This represented 25% of the Federal force and 31% of the Confederate forces. More Americans died in the battle on September 17, 1862, than any other single day in the nation's military history. Lee waited for a counterattack on September 18th that never came. Lee would withdraw from Maryland the next day, and the South resumed a defensive position. Following Lee's retreat from Maryland, McClellan again failed to pursue and deal a knockout blow, even though he promised to do so. McClellan withheld 20,000 troops from the corps of Fitzbrowne Porter and Major General William M. Franklin and cavalry regiment under Brigadier General Alfred Pleasonton. McClellan had feared a counterattack that only existed in his imagination and violated the military principle of economy of force. It was a tactical draw. The Confederates claimed a victory because the Union attack was repelled. It was a strategic victory for the Union. Lee failed to accomplish his objectives. President Lincoln will end up issuing the Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd, which would take effect on January 1st, 1863. And although Lincoln had intended to do so earlier, he was advised by his cabinet to make this announcement after Union victory to avoid the perception that it was issued out of desperation. The Union victory and Lincoln's proclamation played a considerable role in dissuading the governments of France and Britain from recognizing the Confederacy. Some suspected they were planning to do so in the aftermath of another Union defeat. On November 7, because of his reluctance, Lincoln removed McClellan and gave the Army of the Potomac to General Ambrose C. Burnside, who did not want the position. The issuing on September 22nd of the Emancipation Proclamation would take effect on January 1st, 1863. All those enslaved in the Confederate territory to be forever free, and ordered the Army and all segments of the executive branch to treat as free all those enslaved in 10 states that were still in rebellion. In the fall elections, Democrats would gain control of 32 seats in the House of Representatives, governorships in New York and New Jersey, control of state houses in Indiana and Illinois. In his December address, Lincoln recommends to Congress to provide a constitutional amendment to provide for compensation and gradual emancipation in all states. Remember, there are 4 slave states that were still fighting for the Union, where slavery existed. Voluntary colonization of freedmen outside the United States. The immediate effects is that it diffused a radical criticism and unity in his administration. It alienated many Northerners who were Democrats and added a moral dimension to the Union war aim. It also would liberate millions of slaves as Union armies began to conquer the South. Although Lincoln had promised in his inaugural address to protect slavery wherever it existed, once slave lands were taken by federal soldiers, the chief issue became what to do with the slaves that had been captured. With one bold movement, Lincoln was able to turn the war into a war of liberation for the slaves, so that foreign recognition would not be denied, and that the Confederacy, who were looking to try to get recognition from France and England, will not be able to get it because they abolished slavery some years prior. And it encouraged those enslaved in the Confederacy to be less willing to help their masters. The Battle of Fredericksburg. General Ambrose Burnside now was to lead the Federal Army. Lincoln had placed Burnside in command. Burnside was unsure of himself and did not want command, from which the name Sideburns comes from as you look at his whiskers. He marched the Army of the Potomac to the north bank of the Rappahannock River. He was planning to turn Lee and place himself between Lee and Richmond, forcing Lee to attack him. On November 20th, the Union force of 120,000 is in place. Lee's army was thinly dispersed in Fredericksburg and was lightly defended. Jackson was still in the Shenandoah Valley. Burnside would need pontoon bridges in order to cross the Rappahannock River, but they are delayed until early December. Lee's army in northern Virginia, now 74,000, had established themselves along Marines Heights, that was a hill that looked above Fredericksburg. The battle. The Confederate defenses line. Longstreet Corps held the left sector of the line and anchored on the Rappahannock above Fredericksburg. The center was overlooking the town. Jackson had arrived from the Shenandoah Valley, and his corps was concentrated on the right beyond a gorge formed by Deep Run Creek. Stuart's cavalry extended to the right. Burnside's plan. General Edwin Bose Sumner's division would advance to the right, Senator Joseph Hooker's division in the center, and General William B. Franklin's division on the left. Union artillery in the support from Stratford Heights on the other side of the river. The infantry would cross the river and deploy and make a frontal assault. Crossing the Rappahannock on December 11, 1862, some wondered why the Confederates didn't make it so hard for them to cross. They want us to get in. Getting out won't be quite so smart and easy. Before attacking the heights, George Meade. The Union men looted the town, and Major General George Gordon Meade's division of Franklin's command was able to penetrate Jackson's lines, but were driven back in a counterattack. Hooker's attack on Longstreet on Marines Heights was constant, and again the Union charged the fixed position only to be cut down by muskets and the artillery crossfire. The Irish Brigade of the Union kept coming despite heavy losses and was actually cheered on the Confederates, who were also an Irish brigade. The Irish brigade got within 25 paces of the wall, and the men of the 24th Irish that shot them down. Uncommon valor. 14 assaults were beaten back at Marye's Heights. 9,000 Union soldiers fell. Lee would say, "It is well that war is so terrible. We should grow so fond of it." Pinned down, Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and his 20th Maine were pinned down all night long, and so did the freezing temperatures then fall. Chamberlain and his men hid behind the corpses. They were there for the next day and night and dug shallow graves for their comrades. During a truce, Burnside in tears would announce that he would lead the next charge. His subordinates talked him out of it. That afternoon, Burnside asked Lee for a truce to attend to the wounded, which the latter graciously granted. The next day, the Federal forces retreated across the river, and the campaign came to an end. The Angel of Marye's Heights. Testament to the extent of the carnage and suffering during the battle was the story of Richard Rowland Kirkland, a Confederate Army sergeant with Company G, 2nd South Carolina Volunteer Infantry. Stationed at the stone wall by the Second Road below Marye's Heights, Kirkland had a close-up view to the suffering, and like so many others was appalled at the crisis for the health of Union wounded throughout the cold winter night of December 13, 1862. After obtaining permission from his commander, Brigadier General Joseph B. Crenshaw, Kirkland gathered canteens and in broad daylight, without the benefit of a ceasefire or a flag of truce, which was refused by Kershaw, provided water to numerous wounded lying on the field of battle. Union soldiers held their fire, as it was obvious what Kirkland's intent was. Kirkland was nicknamed the Angel of Marye's Heights for his actions. The aftermath. Burnside retired his army across the Rappahannock on December 15th. Lee did not order a counterattack. Jackson tried to move his men forward but came under heavy artillery fire from Stafford Heights and pulled back. The Union lost 12,000 men. The South lost 5,000 men, only learning that many of them had gone home for Christmas. When the Confederates occupied the town, they saw the vandalism. One aide asked Jackson, "How are we going to stop this, General?" "Kill them." In the cartoon, you see the goddess Columbia, a popular depiction of American contemporary cartoons, rebukes President Lincoln for the slaughter of federal troops at Fredericksburg in December of 1862. "Where are my 15,000 sons murdered at Fredericksburg?" The president, as he often did try to diffuse tense situations, makes a weak attempt at humor. This reminds me of a little joke. And then since Columbia cuts him off, "Go tell your joke at Springfield, Illinois." This was typical of the searing criticism Lincoln received in the press and the erosion of public support in the North after this military debacle. The New York draft riots. The Union Army suffered setbacks in the summer of 1862 in Virginia. In the Enrollment Act of March 3rd of 1863, able-bodied men ages 20 to 45 were subject to a national draft. Recruit quotas by congressional district and subtract those who are already served or are serving. It was thought that most would volunteer. Shame, better to volunteer than be drafted. However, that didn't happen. There was the chance of a substitute. To avoid serving, a draftee could hire a substitute. The fee was $300, approximately about $6,200 in 2020. Grover Cleveland, George Templeton Strong, and John B. Rockefeller all avoided the draft by paying for a substitute. Irish immigrants in July of 1863 would riot due to the Enrollment Act. Many were on the draft rolls and could not afford a substitute. They also feared that the newly freed slaves would come to New York and take their jobs. Draft offices were targeted, rail lines were torn up, telegraph wires cut, and African Americans targeted. More than 50 buildings were burned down, including the mayor's home, police stations, and a black orphanage. Troops from Gettysburg would have to be sent to put down the riot in New York. African Americans in the North were organized into an all-black military units, which were led by white officers. As a result, the war continued to change from one to preserve the Union to a war to liberation of millions of enslaved people in the South. In early 1862, Stanton authorized the enrollment of 5,000 black troops in South Carolina. And the Militia Act of July 1862 authorized the U.S. Army to use freedmen in service. The Navy already allowed service regardless of race. The Bureau of Colored Troops, and after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, a large number of African Americans joined the Union Army. The Bureau of Colored Troops was formed to recruit free blacks and formerly enslaved men to fight in the Union military. Lincoln first saw it as being productive of more evil than good, but by 1863 begins to warm to the idea. 50,000 armed and drilled black soldiers on the banks of the Mississippi would end the rebellion at once. About 80% of them were from southern states, including both freedmen and former slaves. Army recruiting squads seized freemen into the service. 179,000 served in the Army, 20,000 in the Navy, and 37,000 would die. The experience. They faced discrimination. They were only paid $10 a month to whites $13 a month, and they were tasked with menial jobs. If captured, they could be considered slaves captured in arms and could be executed. The Confederate government never carried out the threat in fear that Confederate soldiers would face the same punishment. Combat operations, areas where the colored troops, as they were called, would see action. At the siege of Port Hudson, Louisiana, the 54th Massachusetts would fight at Fort Wagner on July 18, 1863, and also in Olustee in February of 1864 in Florida. In Petersburg, Virginia, they also fought, but unfortunately they were thrown into what was known as the crater and were mercilessly decimated. At Fort Wagner, their white colonel, Robert Gould Shaw, would be shot and killed as he tried to send his army in to try to capture Battery Wagner. They also saw action at the Battle of Nashville.